Well, hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeremy Leffler, and I work in the Policy Office at the National Science Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to the NSF Virtual Grants Conference. Before we get started, we'd like to take a quick poll to find out a little bit more about you. If you are using Zoom from a desktop browser, you may not be able to access the poll. And for best results, you want to be sure that you're viewing the presentation from the Zoom application. So we've arranged for the entire grants conference to take place this year online with over 2 weeks worth of webinars for the research community with no more than 2 sessions per day. The content for our series is similar to what it would be for an in-person grants conference. All of these sessions have been pre-recorded. However, we will be taking live Q&A. For information about the sessions and our speakers, please visit the conference website. If you do have questions, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we're encouraging attendees to upvote questions. To upvote a question, you want to navigate to the Q&A function and click on the thumbs up button, and this will bring the most popular questions to the top of the Q&A window. At the end of the presentation, we'll spend some time answering your questions. We'll also be able to answer some of your questions during the presentation as they come in. And however, we do want you to keep in mind that we do have quite a large audience for this session, so we may not get to all of your questions, but bear with us. We're going to do our best. This session is being recorded. It will be made available on our website at nsfpolicyoutreach.com in the coming weeks, and we'll be sure to send an email announcement as soon as the sessions have been posted. If you do have any technical difficulties during this presentation, please also use the Q&A function in Zoom, and somebody will be able to assist you. Thank you for participating in our poll. We're happy and excited that you can join us today, as this marks NSF's first ever virtual grants conference that we're concluding the first week of. We've been doing these conferences for a long time at NSF, and they began as small single-day events with a handful of program staff, and they've grown over the years to 2 full days, 25 to 30 staff, and now a virtual event. We hope that you'll enjoy the conference and any of the sessions that you choose to attend. I'm now pleased to present this session, which will cover the Major Research Instrumentation Program, or MRI program at NSF. And this session will be covered by Randy Phelps from the NSF Office of Integrative Activities.
Thank you all for attending this session of the NSF Grants Conference. As you know, my name is Randy Phelps, Staff Associate in the Office of Integrative Activities, which hopefully you've heard something about by now. I am here to talk about the Major Research Instrumentation Program, but I've titled my presentation Research Infrastructure because as chair of the Midscale Research Infrastructure 1 working group, I'm also going to talk a little bit about that particular program, which has 2 components which bridge the gap between the MRI program and our much larger major facilities. So I normally will talk at my live presentations by starting the talk by asking whether or not people are sponsored projects officers or individual faculty members, and what familiarity people have with the MRI program. Since I can't do that, I will start out with some basics of the MRI program and then move on to some details that you may not be familiar with even if you know about MRI, as well as give some personal perspectives on what makes for a competitive MRI proposal. So first I'll start off with the strategic goals, the very basics of the MRI program. MRI supports the acquisition or development of a major research instrument. There's a lot packed in this paragraph, and I'm going to go through just one by one as we go along. But the acquisition or development is, those 2 words are the most important parts of an MRI proposal. Acquisition, my cartoon sketch, is simply that you go to your favorite Best Buy or Target store and pick up a grocery cart, go down the aisles until you find your favorite 500 megahertz NMR, go through the cash register with your credit card, and you take it home and you plug it in and you're off and running. That clearly is an oversimplification, but that's the basic idea. It's where there is a vendor out there where you can go through your institution's procurement process and basically buy an instrument that exists with the capabilities that you need. Development is when you come up short going to the local department store and you can't find an instrument with the speed, the throughput, the resolution, whatever capabilities that it is that you need. So you go home empty-handed and you talk to your colleagues and they say, well, let's build one of those things. So you get a team together, perhaps with your scientific colleagues, perhaps with some engineers, technicians, maybe some graduate students and postdocs, and you spend your time designing an instrument that has the capabilities that you need. And it takes time to do that. So you go to a machine shop, maybe you design software and you build your instrument and you plug it in and it doesn't work. So you have to go back to the drawing board. Fortunately, as part of your design effort, you had a risk mitigation plan, so you know exactly how to deal with the capabilities that aren't functioning correctly. And it takes time, and you ultimately get an instrument that has those capabilities that you need. You may at that point be able to then patent the instrument that you've just developed or even commercialize it. So those are the two kinds of activities that we like with MRI. Most of the proposals are for acquisition, perhaps for obvious reasons. Development is what we really like because it gives new capabilities to the science community for research. The other words, as you follow through here, are a major research instrument. That's what we'll talk about in terms of dollar value. But in general, too costly or not appropriate for support through other NSF programs. So we often get questions about whether or not something is too expensive, too cheap for the MRI program. I'll talk about the dollar values in a few moments. So, but that is an important part of MRI, but so too is the fact that MRI typically does not support instruments that are available through other NSF programs. There are not many foundation-wide NSF programs for instrumentation, and there aren't that many that are in individual divisions or directorates anymore. But if there are, you should consider applying to those by talking to a program officer in those divisions to find which program is most appropriate for your idea. The other point here is that the instrument is expected to be operational for regular research use by the end of the award period. So by the end of a 3 or 5 year period, and I'll come back to that in a few moments, an instrument should be ready to be used by a multi-user community. That's another hallmark of the MRI program, is it's not an instrument acquisition or development program that supports individual faculty members. The more users, the better off your proposal is going to be. Finally, research training is another important part of the MRI program. And by research training, I don't mean using an instrument in a classroom setting, but rather teaching the next generation of instrument users and instrument builders so that the next generation will have the same capabilities to advance the progress of science and engineering. The solicitation, beginning with the FY 2018 competition, if you've been tracking MRI for years and years and years, had some significant changes with respect to previous years. MRI is a program that's been around since the late 1980s. I haven't been working on the program that long, but it has evolved over the years and over the decades. But the most recent iteration of the solicitation, NSF 18513, had some significant changes that I'll talk about here in just a moment if you've been familiar with MRI for many years. If not, just make sure that you take a look at this solicitation, read it before you go to bed. I promise you'll fall asleep, but make sure that you're familiar with all the ins and outs of the solicitation. The first thing to note is that MRI is going by a submission window, which you may have heard by now through the grants conference. Submission window is just the period of time during which you're allowed to submit a proposal, or which NSF will accept a proposal. The window for MRI, this coming competition, is January 1st to January 19th, 2021. The end date of the window serves as a deadline for the competition. Also note that the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide, which you probably have heard about, is, I believe, 20-1 is expected to apply. There is a new PAP guide in the works, but I don't believe it will be effective for this particular MRI competition. Please note that a solicitation does take precedent over the PAP guide if there is a conflict between the guidance in a solicitation and the PAPPG. Now a little bit more nitty-gritty details about this particular submission competition and the solicitation that I just referred to. Please note that MRI continues to be a submission limited competition. That is, you are at an institutional level only allowed to submit 3 proposals to the MRI competition. It used to be based on acquisition and development proposals, but it is now based on the dollar value of the NSF request. So of those 3 proposals that an institution is able to submit, no more than 2 submissions are permitted in what we refer to as track 1, which are basically proposals that are less than $1 million down to the limit of $100,000 as the minimum submission for MRI. And note that this is based on the NSF request. There is a caveat to that $100,000 minimum request, and that is for proposals that are from non-PhD granting institutions or from the disciplines of mathematics or social behavioral and economic sciences from any institution. $100,000 does not apply as a minimum request, and you may request from NSF less than $100,000. But for most institutions and most disciplines, the track 1 range goes from $100,000 to $1 million for the amount you can request from NSF. There are caveats that are the reasons that I'm using those particular words, and I'll come back to that in just a moment as well. Also, of those 3 proposals, you were able to submit 2 in this track 1. One proposal may be submitted in a track 2, and that is a proposal that goes from $1 million up to and including $4 million. So that's the range for MRI for proposal requests from NSF. The reason that I mention the amount requested from NSF is that because of a congressional mandate in the America Competes Act of 2007, most institutions are required to cost share at the level of 30% of the total project cost. So NSF, you can request from NSF $4 million, up to $4 million, but institutions that are required to cost share the total project cost, including an extra 30%, turns out to be $5.7 million. There is an exception for the cost sharing requirement, and that is for non-PhD granting institutions. So MRI requires that an institution certify itself as one of these 3 types of institutions. One is a PhD granting institution, another is a non-PhD granting institution, and another is a non-degree granting organization. And the qualifications are listed there, and they are in the solicitation, but it's based on the number of PhDs that are awarded in NSF-supported fields of science and engineering. So many of the institutions, most of the institutions that apply to the MRI program are PhD granting institutions of higher education, and they are required to cost share at a level of 30%. About a quarter to a third of the proposals that are submitted to NSF are from non-PhD granting institutions of higher education. And those institutions not only are not required to cost share, they are not allowed to cost share per the National Science Board guidance. But please note that if you are not a PhD granting institution, that does not mean that you are a non-PhD granting institution, because you may fall into the category of a non-degree granting organization. And those are institutions that award degrees but may not award them in NSF-supported fields. Most often, medical schools fall into that category, but there are other types of institutions that also fall into the category. For example, institutions that do not award any degrees. And those institutions are also required to cost share at a level of 30% of the total project cost. I just want to mention that instrument development, since we no longer have it as a submission requirement, it turns out that many institutions are not submitting as many instrument development proposals as we would like. As I mentioned earlier, NSF seeks to support new generation technology, and through development proposals, that is something that we would like to see. So NSF is trying to, the MRI program is trying to reserve up to a third of the MRI award money to support instrument development proposals. And if we don't get them, then it's going to be very hard to award them. So within their submission limit, organizations are encouraged to submit proposals for innovative development projects. I'll come back to the way we allocate the money to the MRI awards here in just a moment, because that's an area that people are less familiar with, and it does impact how you write a proposal. Just a reminder that MRI and NSF in general is seeking to broaden the representation of PIs and institutions in its award portfolio. MRI specifically does this, as I'll come back to in a moment, but we do it in terms of geography, by trying to have institutions spread out across the country, including from EPSCoR jurisdictions. For those of you who don't know, EPSCoR is now the established program to stimulate competitive research, which now constitutes probably a majority of US states, but also from PIs who are women, early career researchers, members of underrepresented minorities, and persons with disabilities. As listed here, MRI encourages PIs to consider facilitation awards for scientists and engineers with disability, so that you can create instrumentation that is available and usable by people who may have more difficulty using standard instruments because of disabilities. So please consider those categories when you're putting together your teams of PIs to submit a proposal to NSF. We strongly encourage these types of proposals with a broad range of not just co-PIs and instrument users, but also principal investigators. And just clarification on what we mean by an instrument. Cyber instruments are something NSF has long supported. Mostly people think of an instrument as going into a laboratory space. That is not necessarily the case. For example, here is a sensor network over the city of Chicago. We have many examples of arrays of instruments that are not confined to laboratories, and MRI considers cyber instrumentation to be a strong candidate for NSF support, but as listed here, that is not appropriate for support through other NSF programs. For example, our Computer Information Science and Engineering Directorate has programs for cyber instrumentation that may overlap with what MRI may support, and it may be more appropriate to submit to those programs. So let me talk just briefly about the review process. And I'm not going to go into any great detail, but since you are at a grants conference for NSF, I have to put up an org chart because you will see a lot of org charts throughout the course of the grants conference. But I just want to highlight here, there are a number of research directorates that are you probably are familiar with now. The Biological Sciences Directorate, Computer Information Science and Engineering, Engineering, Geosciences, Mathematical and Physical Sciences, Social and Behavioral and Economic Sciences, and Education and Human Resources. All of those directorates participate in the MRI program. And I just want to point out, and you probably have heard this, that directorates, those are the directorates that I just mentioned, are akin to colleges at universities. And divisions within those directorates are akin to departments. So, for example, in the mathematical and physical sciences, where I once came as an astronomer in the Division of Astronomical Sciences, there's also the Division of Chemistry, the Division of Materials Research, the Division of Mathematics and Statistics, and also the Division of Physics. And those are basically what you consider to be departments at various colleges that exist within universities. So my first piece of advice is to find your home or homes at NSF before you start submitting a proposal, because that will help you in terms of establishing how a proposal will be reviewed. And I say that because the way that NSF MRI proposals are reviewed is that they are first submitted to my office, the Office of Integrative Activities. I'm not the head of the office, but I reside in that office. And we typically get something like 800 to 850 MRI proposals. I do not review those proposals. I do check them for compliance to the standards of the MRI solicitation in terms of things like page limits, that ask whether or not broader impacts and intellectual merit are separately addressed in the project summary, and there's an overview. Those kind of things, and whether or not cost sharing is required for an institution because the institution has self-certified it as one of those organizations that's required to cost share. Those are the things that I look for before sending a proposal to a division, or basically, because the PI, the principal investigator, has selected the division or divisions on the cover sheet that they think are appropriate for the review of the proposal. So the proposal will come to the Office of Integrative Activities, but it won't stay there. If it is deemed to be compliant, it will be allocated to one of the divisions based primarily on what the PI has selected, but NSF reserves the right to actually put a proposal in a division, in a program, in a panel that is appropriate for the review of that proposal. And just as an example, I'll say that in many colleges, people who work on materials research may be in a department of chemistry or department of physics. So they may instinctively submit to one of those particular programs. But NSF has a division of materials research and a division within the engineering directorate, the chemical, biological, and energy transport division in particular, that deals with materials research in various capacities. So proposals that are submitted to physics that deal with materials research as selected by the PI may end up in another division within MPS or in one of the engineering divisions based on the type of research that's being proposed for the type of instrument that's being requested, and may not be residing in the division where the PI thinks that maybe they should have gone. But NSF does reserve the right to put the proposals in the correct division for proper review. Okay. One of the questions we often get is, since this is a shared use instrumentation program, the more users, the merrier. What happens if people cross over into various disciplines? Will a proposal be reviewed in a single division, or will it be co-reviewed across multiple divisions? The answer is, in most cases, proposals are reviewed across multiple divisions. And the way we do that is by looking at what information you provide to us to help assign the proposals to the right divisions. So, for example, I mentioned on the cover sheet, more than one division can be selected. You can also select reviewers to use, and by providing reviewers suggestions across all the science areas that are being proposed in the proposal, that helps the program officers to find appropriate reviewers across all areas of science that are being covered. So those are a couple of the ways that you can help us to shop around a proposal within NSF to make sure that it gets the proper review. The proposals are all reviewed within the divisions as appropriate for the science that's being enabled by the instrument. I only see the awards that come back from the divisions as recommendations. So it's up to the divisions to recommend the proposals they want to support out of the MRI allocation. How do we do that? Well, MRI typically has a budget of around $75 to $100 million. It varies every year. And we divide that money based on the proposal pressure that each division is reviewing, so that there is comparable success rate by divisions. However, there's an added level of parsing out of the proposal budgets based on the types of proposals, types of institutions that are proposing to each of the divisions. So for example, if a proposals go to chemistry and their share of the MRI budget is, say, $20 million, and half of the proposal dollar-wise are from non-PhD granting institutions or minority serving institutions, then chemistry will get half of the money that they were allocated to support just those types of institutions. So there's not only a comparable success rate by divisions, the way that we allocate the money, but by institution types, there's also a comparable success rate. So if you are from a non-PhD granting institution or a minority serving institution, you're competing against your peer level institutions, not against the more research intensive universities that are competing for money from a separate pot. So that's something to be aware of when you're writing a proposal. I will also mention that some of the money that I talked about is reserved for large proposals. So instead of divvying up the entirety of a $75 million budget or a $100 million budget, we hold out perhaps as much as $20 million for proposals that are over $1 million to guarantee that there is a pot of money that is available to what are the more expensive proposals that program officers may be reluctant to fund based on the fact that they could fund many more smaller awards compared to the larger awards. And in particular, it helps to fund directorates that have very limited submissions to them. For example, our social, behavioral, and economic sciences, they get very few proposals. So out of that initial allocation that I mentioned, they wouldn't have enough money to support a large proposal, even if it was the most highly rated proposal across the entire foundation, unless we held out this reserve of money. Because even though many of the proposals that go to, for example, again, SBE, are smaller level proposals, for example, eye trackers, they often do get one or two proposals that are for functional NMRs that run about $2 to $3 million or so. And finally, a small reserve is held in the Office of Integrative Activities for portfolio balance if, for example, proposals that are interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary don't fare well and still meet a level of support, we can fund those, as well as for proposal, the balance of diversity across the entire portfolio. So finally, I just want to briefly touch on some best practices. I've already mentioned no NSF before you submit a proposal. There are various other things that you probably heard through the course of the grants conference. Searching recent awards, identifying appropriate programs, knowing the purpose and goals and requirements of those programs. So for example, what are the priorities of the chemistry division? Talk to program officers in the divisions where you think you fit. know the proposal and award policies and procedures guide, serve as a panelist if you possibly can. If you're not putting in a proposal for the current competition, volunteer as a panelist, either by contacting me, and I'll put you in contact with a program officer with relevant expertise. Send in a 1 or 2 page biographical sketch. You can talk to successful PIs, and know NSF's role compared to other federal agencies. So the biggest example there is know what the Biological Sciences Directorate funds compare to what the National Institutes of Health funds. And the way you do that is to talk to program officers, for example. So that's a laundry list of things that you should consider. But I also just want to help you try and understand what might make a proposal competitive for MRI. And notice that I do say competitive rather than successful, because I don't know what can make a proposal successful. One of the things to keep in mind is that NSF rarely uses standing panels of reviewers. So when you get if you submit a proposal and you get reviews back, you may address your proposal based on what the reviewers said. And the next time around, you may get a completely different set of reviewers. Maybe 1 or 2 of them are the same as the previous round, but mostly NSF programs don't use standing panels. So you may make a proposal better, but you may not make it compelling. So good proposals may not get funding just because the competition has changed. You are all scientists out there, and you're used to having referees who give you advice on what you should change in a paper that you've submitted. You change that paper based on the referee comments, and the editor may come back and say, thank you, you've done a good job. And now the journal will be, instead of 120 pages, it may be 150 pages the next month. They have that option. When we have fixed budgets, we don't have that option. It's a fixed budget. You compete against your peers for that pot of money, and the next year it's a different pot of money, and you have a different set of people who are competing against that fixed pot of money. So good proposals may not get funded, and you have to keep that in mind as you get your reviews back. So one of the biggest things that I say when I'm telling people how to address MRI proposals when you're writing them is to think like a reviewer. And you probably have heard that before, but it really is important, because reviewers often see 10, 20 proposals that are almost identical in an instrumentation program for 400, 500 megahertz NMR, confocal microscopes, mass spectrometers, whatever it happens to be. And you have to tell a story to say why it is that your proposal should get funded as opposed to the other group there that are competing for maybe 2 or 3 or 4 awards out of that pot of 10, 20 proposals. So what story do you want to hear? It's the science that drives the request. For every MRI proposal, you have to address the science that is going to be enabled by the instrument and justify the instrument based on the science that you're proposing to do. It's not the other way around. Don't say we need I always come back to NMRs, but we need a 400 megahertz NMR. And if we get it, these people will come and use it. That's not the right way to write an MRI proposal. You have to say what compelling science is going to be enabled by our scientists if, in fact, we can get this new fancy schmancy instrumentation, whatever it is, without going specifically to an NMR. And oh, by the way, the number of bells and whistles that you attach to it should be justifiable by the science that is being enabled. So if only one person is going to use an attachment that costs 30% of the cost of a major instrument, it may not be justifiable. But if, in fact, the science is so compelling that that one piece, that one attachment is going to make a huge difference in the science, then maybe you've got a winner there in terms of a proposal and convincing the reviewers. So I've already said a number of these things about what makes a proposal competitive. Buy it, build it, and they will come is not a good way to write a proposal. I already addressed that. Also, demonstrate how your activities will make meaningful contributions within and across disciplines, both in terms of research and research training. Remember that MRI is a research and research training. So if you are a non-PhD granting institution in particular, your strength may be in providing a large number of people who go on to graduate schools at major research intensive universities. Go with that strength and talk about it, because remember, you're competing against your peer level institutions. And maybe you as an institution have a strong track record and are the best positioned ones to do that work. And if another question often comes, what if we don't have a strong track record in terms of publications? Well, there you need to get a commitment from your institution to show that if you get this instrument, it will build capacity for your faculty and students to do research. And you will get, for example, assigned time so that you can do the research that you need. You can actually get publication costs covered if you actually submit a paper to a refereed journal, because MRI is an institutional capacity building program. It says specifically in the solicitation that individual investigators do not need to have awards from the federal government, be it NIH or NSF. But if you don't have that track record, you have to demonstrate why this instrument will help to give you the capacity to build that track record. And some additional thoughts. Almost everybody who's attending this grants conference, I've discovered, are very good scientists, but not everybody is a good manager. These instruments that we're talking about cover the gamut from hundreds of thousands of dollars to $4 million. And in order to operate, maintain them, and make sure that there is a group of core users who are going to get good science and engineering research out of them, you need to be able to manage the instrument very well. So being a good research scientist is one thing, but being a good manager may be something quite different. I always strongly recommend that people take project management courses if they're interested in managing a science lab or a major instrument. It may be overkill. It happens a lot for our major research major facilities, and it's a definite requirement for those, but it builds a mindset for how to manage projects. And it's important to demonstrate in the proposal that the team that is working on the project is going to be able to manage not just the costs, but also the allocation of the resources, the time for the instrument across a wide range of users. Also, again, remember that MRI is a research and research training program. So that is an important element of every proposal that comes to MRI, and also enabling the integration of diversity into NSF programs. Broadening participation is a hallmark of NSF awards. So if you don't have a viable program for broadening participation, including diversity in your projects, your proposal will not fare real well. And I will say that we get a lot of proposals from primarily Hispanic serving institutions, but also from historically Black colleges and universities. And some of the worst proposals I see are ones from those institutions that describe broadening participation, because they leave it to the fact that we are a minority serving institution, therefore they will come. Students are under no obligation to go into STEM disciplines. They may choose something more financially lucrative, for example. So make sure that your proposal has a compelling process by which you will attract a broad range of students into your not only in developing proposal instruments, for example, but also the science that's going to go into using the instruments that you're requesting. I've already mentioned bells and whistles are nice. Ask for what you need, no more, no less, and justify anything that you request, because that will show that you are a good manager. And as I pointed out earlier, so if your proposal is technically flawless, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's compelling. So keep that in mind and think in terms of a reviewer and how you're going to distinguish your proposal from everybody else who's under consideration. And finally, in terms of MRI, I just want to show this graph. It's old now, but it's oldie but goodie, and it is still the same. It shows the number of submissions prior to the MRI deadline. Remember, the effective deadline for MRI this coming competition is January 19th. So on the far right of this graph would be January 19th, followed by to the going leftward, January 18th, 17th, and so on. It turns out that everybody waits until the end to submit a proposal, whether it's a deadline or a window or whatever it happens to be. And that is the worst thing that you can do, because NSF has a hard and fast deadline, not because we're mean people, but because it's fair to everybody else. I already mentioned that MRI gets over order 800 to 850 proposals. If somebody comes in after the deadline and says, oops, I submitted the wrong project summary, I need to change that one with the one that I'm about to send you, I have to say no, because it's not fair to everybody else who submitted before the deadline and doesn't have the opportunity to make changes in their proposal, no matter how small they may seem. So keep in mind that if you submit a proposal well before the deadline, print out the proposal, not the proposal you think you sent to NSF, but the proposal that NSF received. So go into the system that at NSF and take the proposal that NSF received from you and print it out and check it. And if it's days before, you can change the proposal. You can modify it and you can correct mistakes. But if it's after the deadline, there's nothing you can do. And I'll just show you again this graph that shows that 80% of the proposals submitted to MRI in this particular competition and similar competitions since were submitted on the last day of submission eligibility. And worse than that, 50% of the proposals were submitted within 2 hours of the 5 p.m. local deadline. That's putting it right at the limit. And if you've made a mistake, then there's nothing that can be done to correct it. And that's a shame with all the work that goes into proposals. And finally, just briefly, I wanted to mention that on the left of this bridge is the major research instrumentation program, and on the right-hand side are our major facilities that are over $100 million. And in the last couple of years, NSF has created a foundation-wide program called the Mid-Scale Research Infrastructure Program to span the gap between the MRI program, which is effectively at $6 million if you include the requirement for cost sharing, for total project cost, and the major facilities, which again start at $100 million now. Mid-scale is comprised of two different programs, Mid-scale RI1, which goes from $6 to $20 million, and Mid-scale RI2, which goes from $20 to $100 million in terms of the total project cost. And these are now two foundation-wide activities that are available to the community, the research community, for submission of proposals. The latest solicitation for the Mid-Scale RI1 program just recently came out about 2 weeks ago. So NSF 21-505, if you're interested in something between $6 and $20 million, take a look at that. And that again is the total project cost. Preliminary proposals are due January 7th, and full proposals, which are by invitation only, will be April 23rd. The mid-scale RI2 solicitation, at least at the time of this recording, was not yet published, but it is expected to be published soon, so keep aware of that. And on that note, I will say thank you for attending. I'll be happy to, at the end of this session, address questions and provide hopeful answers for them. And I'll turn things back to our hosts for the NSF Grants Conference.
Okay, thank you, Randy, very much. Randy has been furiously typing in answers to questions in the question session here. And Randy, if you're okay with that, I'm going to take the ones that you didn't get to and just start going through those. And we had a number that were upvoted. So I'm just going to follow along and get these questions to you. And we do have a little bit of time here to answer them. So the first question is, what is the best way to get feedback on a pre-submission inquiry and whether that plan proposal aligns with NSF's programmatic activities? What's the best way for somebody to do that?
Well, as indicated in the presentation, I coordinate the overall program, but I do not review the actual proposals. That's done within our various divisions at NSF. So there are something like 20, 25 program officers that are involved with MRI and, for example, bio or chemistry, astronomy, physics, and so on. So if you send a 1 or 2 page summary of your idea to one of those program officers, and probably you'll need to go contact me to find out who that is, I'll be happy to forward them to a program officer to get some feedback. Program officers, especially this time of year, tend to be very busy. So it's very difficult. So don't make it a very long-winded summary. And in particular, NSF program officers cannot comment on the specifics because that would be giving somebody an unfair advantage. So, but they are willing to try and give some feedback as to whether you're on the right track or not.
Great. And the next person is writing, is early career considered within 6 years of receiving their PhD?
Yeah, I didn't answer that one because I had thought it was 7 years, but I defer. Maybe.
Yeah, I don't know that there's an official definition. There are some solicitations, for example, the faculty early career program, which has some very specific details about where the faculty is in their career. So take a look at a specific solicitation.
Well, I do think in the merit review report, they actually talk about early career investigators, and it's something like 6 or 7 years. But again, as Jeremy alluded to, I don't know how official that is as opposed to just a convenient marker.
Okay, and the next question is, would a $1 million collaborative role in a $4 million Track 2 proposal count against an institution's Track 1 or Track 2 slots?
Yeah, there were multiple questions that were related to this idea. So I did provide 1 or 2 answers to that. But generally, MRI requires a single institution with subawards, except for development proposals, where there you can do collaborative proposals. So take a close look at what is allowable in the MRI program. That said, the amount that goes to an institution defines whether it's a Track 1 or Track 2 proposal. So a $4 million project with 2 separately submitted collaborations, if one of the budgets for one of the institutions is less than $1 million, that would count as one of their Track 1 awards. And the remaining balance that would go to the other institution, which is $3 million, plus or minus a little bit, would make it a Track 2 proposal. And there were multiple, as I mentioned, there were multiple questions that were related to that. So I hope that clarifies.
Right, and if you can look through the questions that were answered during the presentation, please go ahead and do that. And if you want to receive the answers that Randy answered during the presentation, you can send us an email, and I'd ask one of our coordinators to put our grants conference email into the chat so that you all can request that, and then we can work to get that to you in the coming days. So the next question is, on a proposal with dozens of users, should we include significant users as senior personnel and provide their biographical sketch and current and pending support and collaborators and other affiliations information for each, and then only provide the biographical sketch for other users?
Yeah, this is also a recurring question. Excuse me. The way that I think of whether or not to have someone as a co-PI or senior personnel is whether or not they are considered to be intellectual leaders of the project. Remember in my presentation, I mentioned that the science drives the request for the instrument. So there are going to be a group of key personnel whose science goals are going to drive the request for not only the instrument, but any attachments, bells and whistles that go along with that. Those people should be considered to be co-PIs or senior personnel and have the full list of documents that are required for personnel of those categories. People who are going to contribute but are not necessarily going to drive all of the science or all of the focus of the project, but are going to help, the instrument is going to help their science. Those people should have the very succinct statement of collaboration that is provided as a template at the end of the solicitation. That, as you had heard, is very similar to the template that is in the PAP guide for statements of collaboration. And I will take some credit for my legacy at NSF because that was first incorporated into MRI a number of years ago and has found its way across the foundation for better or worse. But it does tend to indicate again that we want the roles and responsibilities of people to be described within the project description itself.
Okay, great. And so does the size of the award of the budget affect the likelihood of funding? So does that affect the ultimate review and recommendation of proposals?
I think that question came in before the slide where I talked about the distribution of the budget. But just to reiterate that the way the budget is parsed for MRI is we have various pots of money, if you will, and it is distributed to the divisions based on the proposal pressure that they are, of the proposals they are reviewing. And it's further parsed depending on whether how many proposals are from PhD granting institutions or non-PhD granting institutions and minority serving institutions. The long-winded way, that's my long-winded way of saying there's a comparable success rate across all proposals out of that initial allocation. That said, remember that I mentioned that there is a reserve pot of money that's of order $20 million that we keep for large proposals so that some directorates that don't get a very large allocation out of that initial distribution can still fund something like a functional NMR in the social behavioral economic sciences. It's not surprising, perhaps, that proposals that are in the $1 to $4 million range, which we get fewer of those than we do at the up to $1 million range, are also more complex, require a bit more of oversight, and therefore the success rate for proposals that are over $1 million tend to be less. They're still reasonable, but they do tend to be less.
Okay, and the next question is it reasonable to include funding for a project manager in a proposal?
That will depend on the project, and for both acquisition and for development, you're allowed to ask for personnel in different ways. For acquisition, you can ask for personnel that are required for the direct operations and maintenance of the instrument. Typically for small scale, if you will, small scale being hundreds of thousands of dollars for, again, my favorite example is a 400 megahertz NMR. Project manager would be overkill. Having someone who's a manager in a lab that would spend part of their time working on that instrument to keep it up and running might be appropriate. It might be a faculty member if that, particularly at a smaller institution that doesn't have the resources, the faculty person may need assigned time in order to maintain that instrument. So a project manager will depend on the instrument. We do have some, again, at $4 million, the request from NSF, especially if you have cost sharing that's required, that's almost a $6 million project. And there, having a project manager might make perfect sense. So it will depend on the project whether or not you should consider asking for it.
Okay, you may have addressed this in another question as well, but they're simply asking, can you address a little bit more indirect costs in the budget in a MRI proposal?
Yeah, I wasn't quite sure what that was alluding to. And Jeremy, you may want to chime in on this as well, but all NSF proposals have allowable F&A costs that are negotiated with federal agencies, and you are allowed to ask for those indirect costs. One difference for MRI is that cost sharing, again, is required per congressional language. And when you're doing your budget, it turns out that you have questions perhaps on whether or not what you do with the F&A costs when cost sharing is required. And NSF has a standing policy that unrecovered indirect costs are eligible to be used as cost sharing. So that may or may not address that question. I'm not quite sure.
Right, and I would just refer folks to the PAP guide on indirect costs, which implement the uniform administrative requirements that are applicable to all federal awards. Is it allowable to charge a fee to an internal user if their project is also funded by a federal grant, is the next question.
So you're charging user fees for an instrument that would be paid for from the federal grant, I gather. Is that right?
So I think this may be a question that needs a little bit more explanation. So that's all that I have here at the moment. So it's hard to tell. So we may need a little bit more information on that one.
My first reaction would be to talk to your sponsored projects office. They often have a lot more info. Oh, by the way, I had someone had mentioned that 60% of the poll returns showed that people are from administrative positions rather than faculty positions. I don't know if that's true, but this
we'll have to take a look at it.
Yeah, this presentation, of course, was made earlier, so I wasn't aware specifically of the balance. That does have a different flavor to it than is typical for the grants conferences when they're done in person.
Right. For a grants conference, I think that number switched. We get about 60% faculty and 40% administrator. So can we include the use of the instrument for courses as part of the reason for writing the proposal?
I think I had a similar question that I addressed. MRI is a research and research training program, and research training means to involve students, undergraduates, graduate students, to train them to be the next users of instruments and or developers of instruments. It is not about classroom teaching use. It's not about outreach. It is not about, believe it or not, the research that's enabled, in the sense that MRI funds the research instrument that is involved for the research and the research training. The other items that we mentioned, education, outreach, classroom use, so on, those are broader impacts, and you can certainly incorporate them, but they should not be the focus of a proposal to MRI.
Okay. The next question is, how does instrument development work in conjunction with corporate instrumentation makers?
That's a rather broad question, so I would prefer to talk perhaps a little bit more specifically to that person directly. That said, we do want to have academic departments, academic institutions involved in the development of the next generation instrumentation. So in the solicitation mentions that development proposals need to have a high degree of involvement of the academic institution and build capacity at the academic institution to develop research instrumentation.
there are examples where an instrument that exists in a catalog at a company may not do exactly what is needed in a chemistry department, for example, or whatnot. So you can consider a collaboration where the academic institution works with the company to develop those capabilities. It depends on what the involvement is, whether that constitutes something that is development, building capacity at the institution, academic institution, or what I would call a custom acquisition. That is, you tell the company that you need these particular capabilities and they go off and do it. That's nothing more than an acquisition that is customized for the use. So there is a fine line between having development proposals and something that is more of a custom acquisition. Do you have to have a plan to commercialize that instrument? No, that may well be the case, though. In cases where you're designing something that is new and unique, you should have some description of how you're going to disseminate the designs of those instruments so that if somebody wants to replicate it, they will have a roadmap for being able to do that. I hope that addresses the question in a more general sense.
Great, thank you. Can you speak to the competitiveness of primarily undergraduate institutions and MRIs? Are they supported equally to other types?
I think I already addressed that in the presentation and the distribution of funds. We do have a comparable success rate across all institution types because of the way we parse out the money and wall it off so that, as I mentioned, in each division, proposals that are from primarily undergraduate institutions and minority serving institutions, based on the proposal pressure in those divisions, have a pot of money that can only be used for awards to those types of institutions. And that makes it so that you are competing against your own institution types. So Cal State, where I taught for a while, is not competing against Stanford University at that level. You're competing against your peer level institutions, and there's a comparable success rate in that regard.
Okay.
Oh, by the way, I should mention that because of that, and this was also a question that came in, that we do not allow for RUI components to proposals. You cannot submit an RUI designated proposal to MRI because we already make allowances for the types of institutions that are being considered.
Okay. And this next question has a rather large preamble to it, and you all can see that. But it boils down to the actual question part, which I'm going to ask you, which is, has NSF considered having a program where equipment grants are offered with an upper limit more like $200,000 to meet the need for sharing and collaboration around lower cost equipment?
Yeah, I think the longer preamble related to the fact that some disciplines, particularly, for example, the social behavioral economic sciences, feel that their community, which generally asks for equipment, even at research intensive universities, that is lower cost, doesn't always fare well in the internal competitions at universities because the universities want to go for the big buck kind of projects. As I think I mentioned, I'm an astronomer. We don't have that problem. Our projects tend to be rather expensive, comparatively speaking, but there are very few departments of astronomy that exist. So astronomy proposals also tend, for a different reason, to have a hard time through the internal competitions. So we have talked about that. The issue becomes that this is a foundation-wide program that is considered to be for major research instrumentation. And having a lower budget cap falls into a range that typically is supportable by most institutions at some level. I won't make a blanket statement that say that a $200,000 award for faculty to do some research is easy for an institution to do, but it's far easier for them to do that than it is for them to fund something at the 600, 100, $1.5 million range, for example. So while MRI can't do everything, we feel like we have a pretty good program that's been working for a number of years that satisfies a large number of the projects that are requested from the foundation.
Okay.
That's my long-winded response to long-winded Hamlet.
If the institution has a institutional training program in project management, how should the PI indicate that they've participated in that? They're asking if this would be better, this would be something that would be included in the synergistic activities section of the biographical sketch or in the facilities, equipment, and other resources section.
That was actually the first part there. The synergistic activities was my first reaction at that level, but also within the project description itself for MRI proposals, you have to have a management plan that's put in there to describe how you're going to manage the instrument, deal with the multiple users, schedule the instrument, handle downtime, and so on. So that's also a natural place that I would think that kind of experience could be described.
Okay, and what are your expectations or experience regarding the types of costs that comprise cost share?
Well, Jeremy, you're in policy, so you can. But
I'll defer to you. It's the program you've been running for a long time, so
feel free to chime in afterwards. There are again, talk to your sponsored projects office, because what is eligible for cost sharing is in the U.S. code. But the easiest way to talk about cost sharing in my mind is ignore for the moment that there is such a thing as cost sharing and put down in the budget what it is you need to do for the entire project, the total project cost. And you think of it as though this is what I would ask for from NSF if in fact there were no cost sharing. So if you can't ask for it from NSF in a regular proposal, then you can't use it as cost sharing. So after you've come up with your total project cost of eligible MRI expenses that are described in the MRI solicitation, then 30% of that total project cost is what needs to be provided for cost sharing. So if you can't ask for it from NSF, then you can't use it as cost sharing. And
your first response, which was check with your sponsored projects office, is always a good place to start.
Yeah.
How you talked about being a good manager in your presentation. How would you recommend demonstrating that in the proposal that the PI is a good manager for an MRI proposal?
Someone mentioned they have a training program at their institution. Showing some kind of experience with that would be wonderful. Ultimately, there's a lot of background you should do for any NSF proposal to prepare for it. The more you can provide as experience taking project management courses, or just showing the experience you have doing an existing, managing an existing lab, maybe is a good way as well. So there are multiple ways of doing that. I'm not saying, and I alluded to that project management courses may be overkill at some level for MRI proposals. Not necessarily at the higher end, but certainly at the lower end. But the more you can demonstrate to a reviewer that you are going to be a good manager of an instrument, the better off your project is going to be.
Okay, and the next question is specific to track 2 proposals. Is it better to construct a PI and co-PI team based on expertise with system development or based on their research needs?
What was the development part? I'm sorry.
So is it better to construct a PI, co-PI team based on expertise with system development or based on their research needs?
I think that's a more specific question that I would need to have a little bit more information, because I don't know whether we're talking about acquisition or development. If it's a pure acquisition proposal that happens to be an expensive one, so 900 megahertz NMR or something like that, there's very little development experience that needs to happen, but certainly the science that's going to be enabled and being able to demonstrate being a good manager is important. However, if it's developing a spectrograph for a large telescope, the needs of the science will have to be clear for the capabilities of that spectrograph, for example, but the experience of the team in being able to put a complex instrument together would certainly be something that you would need to show in terms of developing the personnel that are involved.
And Randy, if with those types of specific questions, if should they be contacting you directly, or is there an email alias which you prefer messages go to? How do you prefer to answer some of these questions that are
MRI at nsf.gov will get to me because I'm one of only 2 on the alias list.
Okay. The next question is, does it help to provide an overview of the potential market for proposing instrument development?
That will depend strongly on what kind of instrument it is. As I mentioned, there are potential modifications to existing confocal microscopes or other atomic force microscopes that would have wide use and could be commercializable. And reviewers would certainly like to hear about that. I already mentioned a spectrograph on a large telescope. If you work with a company to do that, there's a very small and probably non-existent market for that, or just having plans available so that someone could replicate ideas if they were aiming to do a similar type of instrument. So it will depend on the instrument itself. Ideally, NSF would love to have patents and spin-offs of a lot of its instrument development projects, for example, but we're realistic in knowing that that's not always possible and it may not always happen.
Okay, and the next question is about collaborative submissions. Is the collaborative total what determines the track, or is it the individual institutional total?
I think we already addressed that.
Did we get that one?
Yeah, it was the individual amount going to an organization determines whether or not it's track 1 or track 2.
Okay, and can you talk about the review process a little bit? Is it similar to that of all other NSF proposals?
It is. As I mentioned, the proposals are distributed to the various divisions, and they are reviewed based on the processes that are appropriate within those various divisions. It is true that some divisions get many more MRI proposals than others. So, for example, I'll just mention that of order 50% of the proposals that come to the MRI program are targeted toward our bio directorate, chemistry division, and materials research, be that in engineering or in the mathematical sciences directorate. So there are other divisions that get very small numbers of proposals. So they may or may not have panels for those smaller numbers of proposals. They may use ad hoc reviews and then have program officers look at the results from that. But it will depend enormously on which division is reviewing the proposals, but they are reviewed very similarly to proposals that come across from all the research programs.
Okay, I think we have time for about one more question, and that is about FOSSID supplements. And the question is, does it require having a disabled principal investigator on the team to help advise on the instrumentation design? Can they recruit a consultant who specializes in this area? And then finally, are there and how many FOSSID supplements are typically awarded to MRIs each year? And I should mention that FOSSID is Facilitation Awards for Scientists with Disabilities.
We have had no requests for MRI to do that, and we are strongly encouraging that for MRI and mid-scale this time around. So I don't have an answer for that, other than everything that was mentioned seemed plausible to me, and we are very strongly looking for those kinds of activities that will enable persons with disabilities to better access research instrumentation and research infrastructure. So I do defer to some of our PIs who have more experience with that. This is new to the programs, and we'll see how this trial goes in the upcoming competitions.
Great. Well, Randy, I want to thank you very much for participating and for sticking around to answer all of these questions, both in the Q&A and live here as well. And I want to thank all of you for attending. And we hope to see many of you beginning November 30th when we begin our second week of the virtual grants conference. So please take a look at those sessions and be well, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you.